We hear the word trauma frequently. Can you explain what trauma is and all that it encompasses, and has everyone experienced trauma to some extent?
Great question. Trauma is definitely a buzzword right now. And so on the one hand, it's not great that we're hearing more about it because we know people are experiencing trauma. And on the other hand, it's good that people are talking about it. I feel like this is a word that historically, when people would hear this word, they would think of very specific events like abuse, war, a plane crash. And while those are certainly examples of types of trauma, what we know now from the research and the advocacy and the awareness around this important realm is that trauma really encompasses a much wider variety of experiences that can impact the brain in the same way that war, a plane crash, and abuse can. And so, in essence, trauma is an event or a series of events marked by intense and extreme fear, danger, either perceived or real, and a feeling of helplessness. And so we know that the prolonged effects of trauma can vary by person, but they're definitely there. And so when I talk with groups about types of trauma and try to educate them about how much more broad that word is, I really like to highlight kind of the 5 most common types of trauma that we might hear about, which are acute, chronic, complex, hidden, and collective. And so when we think about acute traumas, we really think about a point-in-time experience, a car accident, an assault, something that happens and then that experience is done. Chronic trauma is more prolonged exposure to something traumatic, so prolonged exposure to bullying or abuse, domestic violence, or it can be a string of acute traumas. Complex trauma is what we actually see when adults, often we see it when adults seek counseling for the first time. And we see this long history of a variety of traumatic experiences that they've never really processed. So that might be a childhood experience that was particularly challenging, something that happened in adulthood, and so a variety of experiences over time. Hidden trauma is one of the more interesting realms that a lot of people aren't talking about, but it's kind of growing in awareness. And these are environmental circumstances that people experience as just normal life, but they can actually impact the brain in the same way that war or a plane crash or abuse can. And I'll give you an example. Children that experience intermittent periods of homelessness, that exposure to feeling helpless, feeling like I might be in danger, those same feelings that we get from, point-in-time traumas can have the same impact. Growing up gay in a community that might be homophobic or discriminatory, that type of environment can have the same impact. And so it's, to your point, David, therapy doesn't have to be, this is my deepest, darkest secret. It can be, these are my experiences, and I didn't realize how that might have impacted me over time. The 5th and final, and arguably most important, and I think most prevalent of what we're all experiencing now, is something called collective trauma. And that's when a group of people are experiencing an event or a series of events that are marked by intense fear, stress, helplessness. And I think, this is often common with families when we grieve the loss of a loved one, but certainly we're seeing it much more in our communities and on a societal level with the pandemic, of course, we're all in the same boat. And then, of course, so many of the other events that have occurred over the past 14 months.